Deep within the Montana Territory archives, locked away for over a century, lies a leather-bound journal that documents one of America's most disturbing family secrets. The journal, discovered in 1943 by forest rangers clearing an old trapping route, contains 847 pages of meticulous daily entries written in 3 different hands, all belonging to the same family. What those pages reveal about the winter of 1867 in the remote Bitterroot Mountains challenges everything we thought we knew about survival, sanity, and the darkest corners of human nature. The authorities who first read these entries immediately classified them, and for decades, the truth about the Waywright family remained buried in government files deemed too disturbing for public knowledge. Before we continue with the story of Barnabas Waywright and his 3 daughters, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Stories like this one are exactly why we dig deep into America's forgotten archives, and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because the story we're about to tell could have happened in any isolated corner of our vast country during those brutal frontier winters. The discovery of those journals would forever change how investigators viewed missing person cases from the 1860s. Because what happened in that remote cabin wasn't just a tragedy. It was a systematic documentation of how isolation, desperation, and grief can transform even the most devoted family man into something unrecognizable. Barnabas Waywright had built his reputation as one of the most successful fur traders operating between Fort Benton and the Canadian border. At 42, he was known throughout the Montana Territory as a man who could survive where others perished. Someone who understood the rhythms of the wilderness and the delicate balance required to prosper in a land that killed the unprepared. His trading post, situated along Beaver Creek in the Bitterroot Mountains, served as a crucial way station for trappers, prospectors, and the occasional military patrol moving through the region. The Waywright family had represented everything that frontier families aspired to become. Barnabas had married Catherine Bellwether, the educated daughter of a Methodist minister from St. Louis, in 1851. She had followed him west with the kind of determination that defined frontier wives, teaching herself to preserve meat, treat injuries, and maintain a proper household, even when the nearest neighbor lived 30 miles away. Their 3 daughters, Margaret, 26, Elizabeth, 24, and Sarah, 21, had inherited their mother's intelligence and their father's resilience. Unlike many frontier children, they had received a proper education, with Catherine insisting on daily lessons even during the harshest seasons. Margaret, the eldest, possessed an almost photographic memory and served as the family's record keeper, maintaining detailed logs of trading transactions, weather patterns, and supply inventories. Elizabeth had developed remarkable skills as a seamstress and healer, often treating injured trappers who arrived at their trading post with frostbite, infected wounds, or broken bones. Sarah, the youngest, demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict weather changes and animal behavior, skills that had saved the family from numerous potentially dangerous situations. The Waywright trading post occupied a strategic location in a natural clearing, surrounded by dense pine forests, with Beaver Creek providing fresh water year-round and easy access to the main trapping routes. Barnabas had constructed the main cabin with thick logs and a stone foundation designed to withstand the brutal Montana winters that could isolate families for months at a time. Additional outbuildings included a smokehouse storage shed and a smaller cabin that served as guest quarters for traveling traders. By 1867, the family had accumulated considerable wealth by frontier standards. Barnabas owned extensive trapping rights, maintained trade relationships with Native American tribes throughout the region, and had invested in several mining claims that showed promising mineral deposits. The Waywright name commanded respect from Fort Benton to Helena, with military commanders and territorial officials regularly consulting Barnabas about conditions in the northern wilderness. Catherine had maintained meticulous correspondence with her family in St. Louis in her letters from the summer of 1008. 167 painted a picture of contentment and prosperity. She wrote enthusiastically about Margaret's engagement to a successful merchant from Helena, Elizabeth's growing reputation as a healer among the local Native American communities, and Sarah's artistic talents, which had attracted attention from visitors who commissioned her detailed drawings of mountain wildlife. The social dynamics of frontier life meant that the Waywright family lived in relative isolation for much of the year, relying heavily on each other for companionship, intellectual stimulation, and emotional support. During the long winter months, they would gather each evening around the large stone fireplace, with Catherine reading aloud from books ordered from Eastern publishers, the daughters working on various domestic projects, and Barnabas sharing stories from his travels or planning the following season's trading expeditions. This self-sufficient, harmonious existence had continued for over 15 years, with the family successfully navigating the challenges of frontier life through careful planning, mutual support, and the kind of practical resourcefulness that separated survivors from casualties in the unforgiving Montana wilderness. Neighbors, though few and distant, regarded the Waywrights as a model frontier family, proof that civilization and refinement could flourish even in the most remote corners of the American West. October 15, 1867, marked the beginning of what old timers would later call the worst winter in Montana Territory's recorded history. The first blizzard struck without the usual warning signs that experienced frontiersmen relied upon. Descending from the Canadian peaks with a ferocity that caught even seasoned mountain dwellers off guard, Catherine Waywright had been returning from the creek where she'd gone to wash bedding before the winter freeze, when the storm's advanced winds knocked her from the narrow log bridge that spanned the rushing water. Margaret's journal entry from that day, written in her precise handwriting, describes hearing her mother's screams above the howling wind. The three daughters had rushed outside into the blinding snow, following Catherine's voice until they found her trapped beneath the collapsed bridge, her legs pinned by heavy timber in the ice-cold water that was already beginning to form dangerous chunks of ice along its edges. It took the combined efforts of all four remaining family members to free Catherine from the debris, but by then she had been submerged in the freezing water for nearly an hour. Barnabas carried his unconscious wife back to the cabin, where they stripped away her frozen clothing and attempted to restore warmth to her body, using every frontier remedy they knew. For 3 days, Catherine drifted between consciousness and delirium, her body racked with fever and chills that indicated the onset of pneumonia. Elizabeth's journal entries from this period reveal the growing desperation as Catherine's condition deteriorated despite their efforts. The family had limited medical supplies, and the nearest doctor resided more than 80 miles away in a settlement that would be completely inaccessible once the heavy snows began. Catherine's breathing became increasingly labored, and she began speaking incoherently about people and places from her childhood in Missouri, no longer recognizing her husband or daughters during her lucid moments. On October 18, 1867, Catherine Waywright died in her sleep, leaving behind a family unprepared for the psychological devastation of losing the woman who had served as their emotional anchor and moral compass. Barnabas, who had never spent a single night away from his wife during their 16 years of marriage, sat beside her body for nearly 12 hours, refusing to allow his daughters to begin the necessary preparations for burial. The practical challenges of Catherine's death immediately became apparent. The ground had already frozen solid, making burial impossible until spring. Following frontier customs, they would need to preserve her body in the smokehouse until the thaw, a grim reality that forced the family to confront Catherine's physical presence daily throughout the coming winter months. Margaret's journal describes the surreal experience of moving their mother's body, wrapped in their finest quilts, to the cold storage building, where she would remain for the next 6 months. More troubling than the practical considerations, however, were the psychological changes that began manifesting in Barnabas almost immediately after Catherine's death. Sarah's journal entries note that her father stopped sleeping in the bedroom he had shared with her mother, instead spending his night seated in the main room, staring at the chair where Catherine had always sat during their evening gatherings. He ceased maintaining his personal hygiene, allowing his beard to grow wild and his clothing to become increasingly disheveled. The first sign of more serious mental deterioration appeared on October 25th, when Barnabas began having extended conversations with Catherine's empty chair, discussing trading decisions, family matters, and daily household concerns as if she was still alive and responding to his questions. The daughters initially attributed this behavior to grief, assuming that their father would gradually accept the reality of their mother's death and return to normal functioning. However, by early November, Barnabas had begun setting Catherine's place at the dinner table, serving her portions of food that would sit untouched throughout the meal. When Margaret gently suggested that they discontinue this practice, Barnabas flew into a violent rage, accusing his eldest daughter of showing disrespect to her mother and threatening to bar her from family meals if she continued making such cruel suggestions. The isolation imposed by the increasingly severe weather conditions meant that the Waywright family had no external sources of support or reality testing during this critical period. The nearest neighbors, the Henderson family, lived 28 miles south along a route that became completely impassable once the heavy snows began accumulating in late November. Military patrols, which occasionally passed through the area during warmer months, had suspended their activities for the winter, leaving the Waywrights completely cut off from outside contact until spring. Elizabeth's journal entries from this period document her growing concern about their situation, noting that their father seemed to be disappearing into a place where mother still lives, and where the rest of us are becoming strangers to him. She describes finding Barnabas having heated arguments with Catherine's chair, apparently responding to comments or criticisms that only he could hear, his voice rising and falling as if engaged in a real conversation. As November's bitter winds sealed the Waywright family into their mountain isolation, the true weight of their predicament began to settle over the remote cabin like a suffocating blanket. The accumulated snow had reached the bottom of the windows by Thanksgiving, creating a white-walled prison that muffled all outside sounds except the constant howling of the wind and the ominous howls of wolfpacks that seemed to grow bolder with each passing night. Margaret's journal entries reveal how quickly their carefully ordered existence began to deteriorate. Without Catherine's organizing presence, household routines that had functioned smoothly for years started breaking down. Meals became irregular affairs, with Barnabas often forgetting to eat for days at a time, then suddenly demanding elaborate feasts in honor of Catherine's memory. The daughters found themselves walking on eggshells, never knowing what might trigger one of their father's increasingly violent outbursts. The most disturbing change involved Barnabas's treatment of Catherine's possessions. He had moved all of her clothing, jewelry, and personal items from their bedroom into the main living area, arranging them carefully around her chair as if she might return at any moment to reclaim them. He spent hours each day brushing her hair, which he had cut from her head before moving her body to the smokehouse, talking to it as if Catherine could hear every word. Sarah's journal provides the most detailed account of how their father's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She describes finding him in the middle of the night, sitting naked in front of the fireplace, holding intimate conversations with empty air about their early courtship, their wedding night, and private moments that no children should ever overhear. When she tried to cover him with a blanket, he pushed her away violently, screaming that she was interrupting an important discussion with her mother. By December, Barnabas had begun treating his daughters not as his children, but as unwelcome intruders in his home with Catherine. He accused them of stealing Catherine's attention, claiming that their mother spent so much time worrying about them that she couldn't properly focus on her husband. During these accusations, his eyes would take on a wild, unfocused quality that terrified the young women, and his voice would alternate between childlike pleading and threatening growls. The physical isolation was taking its own psychological toll on the daughters, who found themselves trapped not only by the weather, but by their father's increasingly dangerous mental state. Elizabeth's journal entries describe the constant tension of never knowing which version of their father they would encounter. The grieving widower who wept openly for his lost love, or the angry stranger who blamed them for Catherine's death and resented their continued presence in his life. Food supplies, which had seemed adequate when calculated for the family's normal consumption patterns, began running low as Barnabas's grief manifested in either complete loss of appetite or compulsive overeating. The daughters discovered that he had been secretly disposing of portions of their stored meat, claiming that Catherine had told him it was spoiled and unfit for consumption. When they tried to reason with him, he became convinced that they were trying to poison him and Catherine, and he began hiding food supplies around the cabin in places only he could find. The wolves, drawn by the scent of food and the presence of humans, had begun gathering around the cabin in unprecedented numbers. Sarah's artistic skills proved valuable as she documented their behavior, noting that the pack had grown to include more than 30 individuals, far larger than any wolf congregation she had previously observed. The animals seemed to sense the family's vulnerability, approaching closer to the cabin each night, and howling in coordination that created an almost supernatural soundtrack to the family's deteriorating situation. Margaret's journal entry from December 15th marks a crucial turning point in the family's ordeal. She writes, "Father spoke to Mother's chair for 3 hours today, and when he finished, he looked at Elizabeth, Sarah, and me with an expression I have never seen before. It was not the look of a father seeing his daughters. It was the look of a man seeing something else entirely. I fear we are losing not just Father's mind, but his recognition of who we are to him." The entry continues, "He asked Elizabeth to brush her hair the way Mother used to brush hers, and when she complied, he watched with an intensity that made us all uncomfortable. Then he asked Sarah to wear Mother's blue dress, the one from their anniversary last year. When she refused, he became so angry that he threw dishes against the wall and screamed that we were being disrespectful to our mother's memory. But there was something in his voice that suggested he no longer saw Sarah as his daughter. He saw her as something else." Elizabeth's medical knowledge, limited though it was, led her to recognize that her father was experiencing what physicians of the era would have called brain fever or nervous exhaustion, conditions that frequently resulted from severe emotional trauma combined with isolation and physical hardship. However, her understanding of the condition provided little comfort when faced with the practical reality of managing a grown man whose behavior had become completely unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The daughters began sleeping in shifts, with one always remaining awake to monitor their father's activities. They discovered that he had been venturing outside during the night, often without adequate clothing, to visit Catherine's body in the smokehouse. These nocturnal visits lasted for hours, and when he returned, his behavior toward his daughters became even more disturbing and inappropriate. Sarah's journal entry from December 20th provides a chilling glimpse into their father's deteriorating mental state. "Last night, I followed Father to the smokehouse and listened outside. He was talking to Mother as if she were alive, telling her how lonely he was, how much he missed her touch, how empty their bed felt without her. But then his voice changed and he began talking about Elizabeth, Margaret, and me in ways that made my skin crawl. He said we looked like her, that we moved like her, that sometimes when the light was dim, he could almost imagine we were her." Christmas Day 1867 marked the beginning of what the journals would later reveal as the darkest chapter in the Waywright family's ordeal. Margaret's entry for that day begins with an observation that would prove prophetic. "Father woke us before dawn, insisting we dress in Mother's clothing for Christmas breakfast. He had set 5 places at the table instead of 4. And when I asked about the extra setting, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said, 'For your mother, of course. She'll be joining us soon.' The psychological pressure of constant vigilance was beginning to fracture the daughter's ability to cope with their situation. Elizabeth's journal entries reveal that she had begun experiencing severe headaches and episodes of dizziness, symptoms she attributed to the stress of managing their father's increasingly erratic behavior while simultaneously trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life. Sarah's artistic work had taken on a darker quality, with her sketches depicting wolves with human eyes and shadowy figures that seemed to lurk just beyond the edge of perception. The most alarming development occurred on December 28th, when Margaret discovered that their father had been writing letters addressed to Catherine, detailing his growing attraction to the young women who remind me so much of you. These letters, found hidden beneath his mattress, contained explicit descriptions of physical desires and romantic fantasies that no father should ever have about his daughters. Margaret's journal describes her horror at reading these documents, particularly Barnabas's repeated assertions that God had sent his daughters to comfort him in his grief, and that Catherine's spirit had told him it was acceptable to seek solace in their arms. Elizabeth's medical training led her to research the few books they possessed about mental illness and nervous disorders. She discovered references to cases where prolonged grief and isolation had resulted in complete breaks from reality, with sufferers losing the ability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate relationships. However, her growing understanding of their father's condition provided little comfort when confronted with the practical reality that they were trapped in a remote cabin with a man whose moral compass had completely dissolved. Sarah's journal entry from January 2nd, 1868, documents the first direct confrontation between the daughters and their father's inappropriate behavior. Father cornered Elizabeth in the pantry this morning and tried to kiss her on the mouth, telling her she looked beautiful in Mother's apron. When she pushed him away, he became enraged and accused her of being cruel and unloving. He said Mother would never have refused his affection, and that Elizabeth was failing in her duty as a woman to provide comfort to the man of the house. The incident terrified all three daughters, who realized that their father's mental deterioration had progressed beyond mere grief and confusion into something far more dangerous. Margaret's journal reveals their desperate attempts to develop strategies for protecting themselves while avoiding actions that might provoke even more violent behavior from their increasingly unstable father. The wolfpack's behavior had also grown more aggressive and organized. Sarah's observations noted that the animals had begun approaching the cabin during daylight hours, showing no fear of human presence and demonstrating hunting behaviors that suggested they were actively stalking the family. The constant howling at night had evolved into complex vocalizations that seemed almost like communication, creating an atmosphere of siege that added to the family's psychological stress. Food supplies had reached critically low levels, with their father's erratic eating habits and waste of provisions creating a genuine survival crisis. Elizabeth's calculations suggested that their remaining stores would last no more than 6 weeks, assuming normal consumption patterns, but Barnabas's behavior made rational resource management impossible. He had begun hoarding food in secret locations throughout the cabin, claiming that Catherine had warned him about potential thieves, and he refused to eat anything that his daughters had prepared, insisting that only Catherine could be trusted to handle his meals. Margaret's journal entry from January 8th reveals the extent of their desperation. We have discussed the possibility of attempting to reach the Henderson place despite the weather and the wolves. Elizabeth believes she could survive the journey, but Sarah's smaller stature and my own lack of wilderness experience make such an attempt extremely dangerous. More troubling is the question of whether we could leave Father alone in his current condition, and whether he would allow us to leave at all. The daughters had discovered that their father had been disabling their winter equipment, removing snowshoes from their usual storage places, and hiding essential cold weather gear. When confronted about these items, he claimed ignorance, but his behavior suggested a deliberate attempt to ensure that his daughters remained trapped in the cabin with him. Elizabeth's journal notes, I believe Father understands on some level that his thoughts and desires regarding us are wrong, but rather than fighting against these feelings, he is ensuring that we cannot escape from them. The most disturbing revelation came when Sarah discovered additional letters that her father had been writing not to Catherine, but to each of his daughters individually. These documents, hidden in the smokehouse where he spent his nightly vigils, contained detailed descriptions of his growing romantic obsession with each young woman, complete with plans for courtship and marriage that demonstrated a complete break from reality and moral reasoning. Sarah's journal entry describing her discovery of these letters provides insight into the family's deteriorating situation. Father's letters reveal that he no longer sees us as his daughters. In his mind, we have become available women who happen to live in his house, potential wives who could replace mother in every way. He writes about our physical attributes, our personalities, and our potential as romantic partners with the same clinical detachment he once used to evaluate trading opportunities. Most terrifying of all, he seems to believe that mother has given her blessing to these arrangements through communications he receives during his visits to her body. By mid-January, the daughters had realized that their survival depended not only on enduring the remaining winter months, but on managing a father whose mental illness had transformed him into a potential threat to their safety and dignity. The journals revealed their growing understanding that the man they had loved and respected throughout their lives no longer existed. In his place was a stranger whose desires and intentions grew more dangerous with each passing day. The blizzard that began on January 18, 1868, would later be remembered as the most severe storm in Montana Territo's recorded history. But for the Waywright family, it represented something far worse than a meteorological disaster. It was the final barrier between their father's deteriorating sanity and complete moral collapse. Margaret's journal entry for that day contains a single terrifying sentence. "The storm has made escape impossible," and father announced at breakfast that God has answered his prayers by ensuring that his new wives cannot leave him. Elizabeth's medical observations provide crucial insight into Barnabas's rapidly accelerating mental breakdown. She noted that her father had stopped sleeping entirely, instead spending his nights alternating between passionate conversations with Catherine's empty chair and increasingly aggressive attempts to engage his daughters in inappropriate physical contact. His appearance had become grotesque: wild hair, hollow eyes, and a gaunt frame that made him appear more like a starving animal than the respected frontier businessman he had once been. The discovery of Barnabas's marriage preparations sent waves of terror through the isolated cabin. Sarah's journal describes finding wedding rings that their father had crafted from melted-down silver coins, along with crude marriage certificates that he had written out in his deteriorating handwriting. These documents, witnessed by Catherine Wainwright in the same handwriting, declared his intention to marry each daughter in separate ceremonies that he had planned for the coming weeks. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Bitterroot mountains intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this true tale of survival and madness. Margaret's journal entry from January 22nd reveals the family's growing desperation. Father cornered me in the storage room today and showed me the ring he made for our wedding. And when I told him that fathers cannot marry daughters, he became violent and screamed that I was not his daughter anymore. I was a woman living in his house, eating his food, and therefore obligated to provide him with the companionship that mother's death had taken away. His eyes held no recognition of our relationship, only a hunger that terrified me. The systematic nature of Barnabas's planning became apparent when Elizabeth discovered detailed schedules that he had created for his courtship of each daughter. These documents, written in the precise handwriting he had once used for business ledgers, outlined specific days for romantic meals, intimate conversations, and physical expressions of affection with each young woman. The cold, business-like tone of these plans made them even more disturbing than if they had been written in passionate language. Sarah's artistic talents proved valuable in documenting the physical evidence of their father's mental breakdown. Her sketches show the interior of the cabin, transformed into a grotesque parody of a romantic setting, with Catherine's belongings arranged as decorations for the planned wedding ceremonies. The most disturbing image shows their father's bedroom, which he had redecorated with items stolen from his daughter's personal possessions. creating a shrine that combined memories of his dead wife with fantasies about his living daughters. The wolfpack's behavior had reached unprecedented levels of aggression, with the animals now actively testing the cabin's defenses during daylight hours. Elizabeth's observations noted that the wolves had learned to work in coordinated groups, with some animals creating distractions, while others searched for weaknesses in the building's structure. The constant presence of the pack had eliminated any possibility of escape, even during brief periods when the weather might have permitted travel. Food supplies had reached crisis levels, but Barnabas's hoarding and waste had created an even more dangerous problem. He had begun using food as a tool of control and manipulation. Margaret's journal describes how their father would withhold meals from any daughter who refused his inappropriate advances, claiming that wives who didn't show proper affection to their husbands didn't deserve to eat. This psychological warfare through starvation represented a new level of calculated cruelty that demonstrated his ability to plan and execute complex strategies despite his obvious mental illness. The most terrifying incident occurred on January 28th, when Elizabeth woke to find her father standing over her bed, completely naked and holding one of his homemade wedding rings. Sarah's journal describes hearing Elizabeth's screams and rushing to help, only to find their father in a state of sexual arousal, attempting to force the ring onto Elizabeth's finger while mumbling prayers about consummating God's will. The three daughters were forced to physically restrain their father, an experience that left them all traumatized and certain that more serious assaults were inevitable. Elizabeth's journal entry from that night reveals the family's complete despair. "We can no longer pretend that father might recover his senses, or that this situation will resolve itself with time. He has become a predator living in our home, and we are his intended prey. The man who taught us to read, who protected us from dangers, who loved us as daughters no longer exists. In his place is something that sees us only as objects for his gratification." The daughters' attempts to reason with their father had become not only futile but actively dangerous, as any resistance to his advances provoked increasingly violent responses. Margaret discovered that Barnabas had been sharpening kitchen knives and had hidden weapons throughout the cabin, apparently preparing for the possibility that his daughters might attempt to resist his plans through force. His military experience from his younger days had taught him tactical thinking that made him a formidable opponent despite his deteriorated mental state. Sarah's journal provides the most chilling insight into their father's current mental state. "When father looks at us now, I see no trace of paternal love or protection, only the calculating gaze of a man evaluating potential conquests. He has convinced himself that mother's death freed him from normal moral constraints, and that his daughters are compensation for his loss. Most terrifying of all, he seems genuinely unable to understand why we find his advances unwelcome, as if our revulsion and terror are simply obstacles to be overcome through persistence and force." By early February, the daughters had realized that their survival depended on developing defensive strategies that their father's military background and intimate knowledge of their personalities would make extremely difficult to implement. They had begun sleeping in shifts, barricading doors with furniture, and hiding makeshift weapons throughout the cabin. However, these precautions provided only temporary protection against a man who had both the physical strength to overpower them and the psychological cunning to exploit their emotional attachments and moral reluctance to seriously harm their father. February 14th, 1868, Valentine's Day, marked the culmination of Barnabas Waywright's descent into complete madness and the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt the Montana Territory for generations to come. Margaret's journal entry for that morning contains perhaps the most chilling sentence ever written by a frontier woman. Father announced that today was the perfect day for his wedding to Sarah, and that Elizabeth and I would serve as witnesses to God's blessing on their union. The final confrontation began when Sarah refused to put on Catherine's wedding dress, which Barnabas had carefully preserved and altered to fit his youngest daughter's smaller frame. His reaction to her refusal demonstrated the complete collapse of any remaining paternal instincts. He struck Sarah across the face with such force that she fell against the stone fireplace, opening a gash above her left eye that would leave a permanent scar. Elizabeth's medical training proved crucial during the violent struggle that followed. When Barnabas attempted to physically force Sarah into the wedding dress, Elizabeth struck him with a heavy iron skillet, temporarily stunning him and providing the daughters with their first real opportunity to fight back against his increasingly aggressive advances. However, their father's military experience and superior physical strength made him a formidable opponent, even in his deteriorated mental state. Margaret's journal provides a detailed account of the brutal fight that ensued. Father recovered from Elizabeth's blow and came at us like a wounded animal, no longer speaking words, but making sounds I had never heard from a human throat. We fought him with kitchen utensils, fireplace tools, anything we could reach. But he seemed to feel no pain, and showed no recognition that he was fighting his own daughters. His eyes held only rage and a terrible hunger that made him appear more wolf than man. The battle raged throughout the cabin for nearly an hour with furniture overturned, windows shattered, and blood spattered across every surface. Sarah's artistic skills allowed her to document the aftermath with disturbing accuracy, showing the main room transformed into a battlefield where a family had quite literally fought for their souls. The most disturbing element of her sketches was the presence of Catherine's belongings scattered throughout the destruction, silent witnesses to the complete collapse of everything the family had once represented. Elizabeth suffered a broken wrist during the struggle, while Margaret received a deep cut across her shoulder from a kitchen knife that their father wielded with military precision. Sarah, despite being the smallest and youngest, proved most effective at evading Barnabas's attacks, using her knowledge of the cabin's layout and her father's behavioral patterns to stay one step ahead of his increasingly desperate lunges. The turning point came when Margaret realized that their father's obsession with Catherine could be used against him. While Elizabeth and Sarah continued to fight defensively, Margaret began screaming that Catherine disapproved of his behavior, that their mother's spirit was angry about his treatment of their daughters. The psychological impact of these accusations momentarily broke through Barnabas's madness, causing him to stop his attack and stare in confusion at Catherine's empty chair. Sarah's journal describes the crucial moment when father heard Margaret invoking mother's disapproval. Something changed in his expression. For just a moment I saw a flash of the man he used to be, horrified, confused, and terrified by what he had become. But then his face hardened again and he said something that will haunt me forever. "Catherine is dead, and you killed her by being born. Now you'll replace her or you'll join her." The final phase of the confrontation occurred when Barnabas, realizing that his daughters would never willingly submit to his desires, decided to use force to achieve his objectives. Elizabeth's journal entry describes their father's systematic attempt to overpower and assault each daughter, beginning with Sarah as his primary target. The clinical detachment with which she documents these events speaks to the trauma that allowed her to function despite the horror of fighting for her life against the man who had once protected her from every danger. Margaret's quick thinking saved all three daughters when she managed to grab one of the oil lamps and threatened to burn down the cabin unless their father backed away. The threat worked temporarily, but Barnabas's military training led him to realize that his daughters lacked the ruthlessness necessary to carry out such a desperate action. They would never willingly destroy their only shelter during a Montana winter, even to escape his advances. The stalemate that followed lasted for nearly 6 hours, with the daughters barricaded in the storage room, while their father alternated between pleading for their cooperation and making increasingly violent threats about the consequences of continued resistance. Elizabeth used her medical knowledge to treat Margaret's and Sarah's injuries, while they debated their limited options: remain trapped until spring while avoiding assault, attempt to escape into the blizzard and almost certain death, or find a way to permanently neutralize the threat their father represented. Sarah's journal reveals the terrible decision that ultimately saved their lives. We realized that the man outside our door was no longer our father. He was a predator who intended to use our bodies for his gratification, whether we consented or not. The father we had loved was dead, killed by grief and isolation as surely as mother had been killed by the creek. What remained was something that would destroy us physically and spiritually if we allowed it to continue living. The final entry in Margaret's journal for February 14th consists of a single sentence that captures the complete moral collapse of a once loving family. Tonight we learned that survival sometimes requires choices that destroy the survivors, as completely as death would have destroyed their bodies. The discovery of the Waywright cabin in April 1943 by Forest Service rangers conducting a routine survey of old trapping routes created one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Montana's recorded history. Ranger Thomas Kovac's official report filed with both the Forest Service and the Territorial Marshal's Office described finding the partially collapsed remains of a frontier cabin containing the desiccated bodies of 4 individuals and evidence of violent conflict that had occurred decades earlier. The initial investigation revealed the presence of 3 female bodies in the cabin's main room, along with extensive documentation in the form of journals, letters, and detailed drawings that provided investigators with an unprecedented look into the psychological breakdown of a frontier family. During the brutal winter of 1067-68, the 4th body, identified as an adult male, was discovered in the smokehouse, where it had apparently been placed deliberately alongside the preserved remains of a woman who matched the age and physical description of Catherine Wainwright. Dr. William Hartley, the territorial coroner who examined the remains, determined that the 3 daughters had died from a combination of starvation and exposure during the late winter or early spring of 1068. His medical examination revealed evidence of physical violence, including healed fractures and defensive wounds that supported the violent encounters described in their journals. More disturbing were signs of prolonged malnourishment and stress-related physical deterioration that indicated months of psychological trauma preceding their deaths. The male body in the smokehouse presented a different story entirely. Dr. Hartley's examination revealed that Barnabas Waywright had died from a single puncture wound to the heart delivered with surgical precision that suggested medical knowledge of anatomy. The wound's location and angle indicated that the victim had been conscious and facing his attacker at the time of the injury, ruling out the possibility of accident or suicide. Elizabeth's final journal entry, dated February 15, 1868, provided the missing pieces of the Waywright family's tragic conclusion. Father is finally at peace, reunited with mother in the smokehouse where he spent so many nights speaking to her spirit. We could not allow him to continue living with the madness that had consumed him, and we could not survive another day as prisoners in our own home. Margaret held him while Sarah and I did what had to be done. He looked surprised at the end, but also relieved, as if he finally understood what he had become. The journal continues, we wrapped Father in Mother's favorite quilt and placed him beside her in the smokehouse, where they can be together as they always wanted. The storm has passed, but we are too weak to attempt the journey to the Henderson place. Our food supplies are gone, and the wolves have grown bolder with each passing day. Margaret can barely walk. Sarah has developed the same fever that took Mother, and my own strength fails more each hour. We have agreed that we will not become like Father. We will not allow desperation to transform us into something monstrous. The final entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting by all 3 daughters, reveal their conscious decision to remain in the cabin rather than attempt an escape that would likely result in death by exposure or wolf attack. Their last written words demonstrate a remarkable clarity about their situation and a dignity that their father's madness had nearly destroyed but could not ultimately conquer. Sarah's artistic talents provided a final gift to investigators, detailed sketches of the wolf pack that had besieged the cabin throughout the winter. Her drawings showed the animals in unprecedented numbers with behavioral patterns that suggested near supernatural intelligence and coordination. These illustrations would later prove valuable to naturalists studying wolf behavior in extreme winter conditions, but they also created an eerie reminder of the hostile environment that had contributed to the family's psychological isolation. Margaret's mathematical precision extended to her final entries, where she calculated the exact number of days the family had been isolated, 127, the temperature variations throughout the winter, and even the estimated number of wolves in the pack that surrounded their cabin. Her last entry, dated March 8, 1868, consists of a simple statement. Today marks 143 days since Mother's death. We have decided that 144 will be enough. The investigation revealed additional disturbing details about Barnabas Waywright's final weeks. Hidden throughout the cabin, investigators found more than 60 letters addressed to various women, some to Catherine, others to his daughters, and several to women whose identities could never be established. These documents provided insight into a mind that had completely lost touch with reality, constructing elaborate romantic fantasies and justifications for behavior that demonstrated total moral collapse. Dr. Hartley's psychological evaluation, based on the extensive documentation left behind by the family, concluded that Barnabas had suffered what modern psychiatry would classify as a complete psychotic break triggered by grief, isolation, and the extreme stress of frontier survival. His report noted that similar cases had occurred throughout the territories where the combination of harsh conditions and social isolation had produced breakdowns that transformed otherwise moral individuals into dangers to their own families. The territorial marshal's investigation focused on whether any laws had been broken by the daughters' killing of their father. However, the extensive documentation of Barnabas's threats, violence, and attempted assaults led officials to classify death as justifiable homicide in defense of life and virtue. The case was quietly closed with no charges filed, partly out of respect for the victims and partly because territorial officials preferred to avoid the publicity that such a disturbing case might generate. Forest Service records indicate that the cabin site was deliberately obscured and removed from official maps following the investigation. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves at an undisclosed location, and all physical evidence was either destroyed or placed in sealed archives that remain classified to this day. Official explanation for this secrecy was protection of the family's reputation. But internal memos suggest that territorial officials feared the psychological impact such a detailed account of family breakdown might have on other isolated frontier families. The Wainwright case influenced territorial policy regarding winter isolation and emergency procedures for remote families. New regulations required traders and settlers in isolated locations to maintain regular contact with authorities during winter months, and emergency supply caches were established along major routes to provide refuge for families attempting to escape dangerous domestic situations. Local Native American tribes, when questioned about the winter of 1867-68, provided additional context that investigators found both fascinating and disturbing. Tribal elders reported unusual wolf behavior throughout the region that winter, with pack formations and hunting patterns that differed significantly from normal territorial behavior. They also described hearing human screams and voices carrying across the mountains on winter winds, sounds that tribal members attributed to spirits of the broken family, that investigators now understood were likely the actual voices of the Wainwright family during their months of torment. The journals themselves became the subject of extensive study by territorial officials, medical professionals, and early psychologists who recognized their value as documentation of mental illness and family breakdown under extreme conditions. However, public access to these documents was restricted due to their disturbing content and the detailed descriptions of incestuous desires and violence they contained. Modern analysis of the case has revealed additional disturbing elements that were not fully understood by 1943 investigators. Handwriting experts have determined that some of the later entries in Barnabas's hidden letters were actually written by Elizabeth, suggesting that she had been forced to transcribe her father's dictated fantasies as part of his psychological torture of the family. This discovery added another layer of horror to an already devastating story of manipulation and abuse. The meteorological records for the winter of 1867-68 confirmed that the Bitterroot Mountains experienced the most severe weather conditions in recorded Montana history with temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero and continuous snowfall that accumulated to depths of more than 12 ft. These conditions would have made escape impossible for even the most experienced wilderness travelers, creating a natural prison that trapped the Waywright family with their father's growing madness. Wildlife biologists studying wolf behavior have noted that the pack sizes and coordination described in Sarah's drawings represent unprecedented examples of predator organization under extreme environmental stress. The suggestion that more than 30 wolves had gathered around the cabin indicates environmental pressures that forced normally territorial animals into cooperative hunting arrangements that would have made any human movement outside the cabin virtually suicidal. The case has been referenced in numerous studies of frontier psychology, domestic violence, and survival behavior under extreme conditions. However, the specific details of the Waywright family's ordeal remain largely unknown to the general public, relegated to academic discussions and classified government files that few researchers have been permitted to access. Recent attempts to locate the original cabin site have been unsuccessful, with Forest Service records indicating that the location was deliberately obscured and that natural processes have eliminated most traces of the structure. Local hiking guides report occasional discoveries of metal artifacts and bone fragments in the general area, but these findings have never been officially confirmed as related to the Waywright case. The wolf population in the Bitterroot Mountains declined dramatically following the winter of 1067-68, with tribal reports suggesting that the large pack, documented by Sarah Wainwright, dispersed or died during the severe weather conditions. Modern wolf reintroduction programs in the region have noted unusual territorial behaviors in areas near the suspected Way cabin site, with animals showing reluctance to establish dens or hunting grounds in locations that seem environmentally suitable. This mystery shows us how quickly civilization's thin veneer can dissolve when faced with isolation, grief, and desperate circumstances. The Waywright family's tragedy reminds us that the frontier demanded not just physical survival skills, but psychological resilience that even the strongest individuals sometimes lacked. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in those Montana mountains? Leave your comment below and let us know what you think really happened during those dark winter months. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories from America's hidden past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The frontier holds many more dark secrets, and we'll be here to uncover them all. See you in the next video.